Annie, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast, because we
Well,
spoke a
thank you.
couple of years
Thank you.
ago
I'm
about,
excited. Listen, I'm gonna go for another time because I am about 40% of the way through my next book.
oh,
So yeah. So well, it would be a 2022 book, but I'm hoping that we just sort of make this like every 2 years or something,
fantastic. Yeah, yeah, let's do it.
if
Let's
I
do it.
can keep on pace.
Yeah, yeah, let's do it. So, to kick things off, some of my listeners may not have caught our previous conversation, which was all about your earlier book, Thinking in Bets. And so, if you could just paint a little background as to who you are and then why you wrote this particular book.
Sure. So, oh gosh, who am I? Isn't that the question we all ask ourselves? Particularly now, this year has been a big "Who am I" year. Um, okay, so I'm probably best known, I guess, for being a professional poker player, which I was for about 18 years. Um, I won some things. That was nice. A World Series of Poker bracelet, the NBC National Heads Up Challenge, Championship, rather. Won the Tournament of Champions, a few other things. Um, but prior to being a poker player, becoming a poker player, I was actually an academic. I did 5 years of PhD work at Penn. I phrase it specifically that way because that's what you call ABD. So right at the end of the 5 years, actually, as I was going out for my job talks, I got sick and I had to take a year off. That's actually when I started playing poker, which I imagined I would do in the meantime. Sometimes the meantime is a long time,
Yeah.
which it was for me. Um, but about 8 years into my poker career, so right around 2002, um, I started giving talks actually on kind of the intersection of poker and cognitive psychology, cognitive science, which is what I had been studying in graduate school, kind of thinking about how they could inform each other. Because obviously, poker is this very high stakes, very fast paced decision making under uncertainty problem. It's a lot of uncertainty in poker. So a lot of the work in cognitive science and decision making, behavioral economics, are really looking at people's behaviors in those kinds of systems, particularly as you start to add uncertainty into the mix. Um, and starting in the 70s with Kahneman, Tversky, and Richard Thaler, and so on and so forth, like people really started thinking about things differently. Like the prior to that, people said, well, if people have perfect information and the market would be totally rational and people would be totally rational. And what those pioneers were really saying was, no, that's not true. There's lots of ways that human decision making goes sideways. And in poker, you really feel that all the time, that you feel how that can go sideways and what the effect on your bottom line is. So I thought those two disciplines really would inform each other. So that's what I started doing in 2002. And then for about 10 years, I overlapped. Um, and slowly but surely, more of my life was spent kind of back in this kind of thinking about it from an academic sense, thinking about it as sort of a science communicator, a communicator about decision making. 2012, I retired and started to do this really full time, which it already was pretty close to full time anyway. Um, Now I do consulting, I do speaking, I write, I wrote Thinking in Bets, then How to Decide, this new book, and I co-founded rather, the Alliance for Decision Education. So there you go, my windy path in like 5 minutes or less.
Love it. Fantastic. And I want to talk a little bit, well, I want to talk about the origin story of How to Decide. And first of all, congratulations. It's a fabulous book.
Oh, thank you.
I loved it because it's one of those books that takes a lot of complex theory and science and lots of things and makes it, I think it's quite digestible from the
Oh,
point of
that's
view of a
great.
lot of people.
Thank you.
And the way that you pull it together, it's kind of elegant in that way. You know that there's the stuff that seems quite clear, but it's also, that it's very nutritionally dense in terms of the amount of science that's behind it. So I loved it. It's fabulous. But I want to just can we just explore, like, I think it's a very timely book, but what was the origin story of that book?
Sure.
How did you decide to write that book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say, in terms of those lovely compliments that you gave the book, that I just want to give a shout out to Michael Mauboussin, because I, obviously, everything that I do is really deeply informed by science. It's incredibly important to me that the ideas that I'm thinking about and sort of synthesizing are coming from that world, and then I'm definitely giving credit to that world. But when you're doing that and you're trying to translate that to people who aren't subject matter experts, I just always have this really big fear of sort of two things. One is I'm going to be too wonky and it's not going to be, people aren't going to understand what I'm saying. Or the reverse, actually, that I'm going to simplify to a point where the concept doesn't really have the same meaning anymore. It's not useful in the way that it would be if you were really translating the science in a way that had fidelity. So I was worried about both of those things. Michael Mauboussin had read every word of this book basically as I produced it, commented really deeply on, so I was basically sending him chapter by chapter. And he was really acting as that person who was saying to me, this is too simple or this is too complex, and helping me to sort of navigate and walk that line between those two places. And this book would not be nearly as good without him. And I certainly would have been much more anxious about releasing it and much more worried that I had oversimplified or undersimplified both problems without him. So I just like to give a shout out to Michael, who was really such a great help in producing this book. So anyway, but the origin story is basically this. Lots and lots has been written in the space, which is like, here's how bad you are at decision making, which is really, really useful, right? If you think about like Thinking Fast and Slow and what, Kahneman produced with that book. The thing is that I think now we're a little more used to this idea that maybe we're not so great at decisions, and there's all sorts of cognitive bias and noise, and we use these shortcuts that sometimes work but mostly don't, and but again, going back to that origin, like this was something that like Thaler and Kahneman and Tversky were really kind of fighting against, this idea that people are perfectly rational and they're always acting in their own best self-interest and whatnot. So I think that groundbreaking work and bringing that into the popular literature was so incredibly important. And I would say Thinking in Bets, I would say, is in that genre. There's like probably a little bit more sprinkling of kind of practical stuff, just because I was a poker player, so I was trying to think about how to solve these things from a practical standpoint. But it's a lot of here's where things go wrong, with a big focus on resulting, motivated reasoning, so on and so forth. So I would put it sort of in that genre. So what I heard from readers after I put that book out was, how? Like I gave some hints sort of in the second half of the book, but I didn't really go deeply into here's how you would think about a past decision and try to figure out what the quality of the decision was. And then much more importantly, here's how you would, as you make decisions going forward, here's the kinds of things that you should think about. Here's how you might want to construct that decision. Here's how you might elicit feedback from other people, why that feedback is so important, right? And how you would do that. Here's how you can figure out if you should take time on a decision or go really quickly. That one in particular was important to me because I was a little horrified when I had a few people who had read Thinking in Bets say, so it seems like you're just saying like you have to go really slow and be really deliberate in all your decisions because we go too fast and we make lots of mistakes. Now, that's my fault, by the way, for not being clear. I've reread it and I see why somebody would come across with that opinion. But boy, was I horrified because I was a poker player. It was all about making really fast decisions. So thought I'd rectify that. So I wanted to really talk about how would you think about what type of decision. And then, these things about like how would you actually think about sort of spotting the places where your decisions might go wrong in the future so you can get ahead of them. And how could you actually create better group decision making and really show people here are the tools that you could do for that. So really dig down into kind of this practical implementation of tools and processes that could help to mitigate some of these issues that, Kahneman and thaler are really trying to, evangelize to the world as problems with our decision making.
Yeah, it's I think it's very timely because we're making decisions all the time. And I want to start with resulting, actually, because since we spoke last and since I read Thinking in Bets, I don't know how many times I've used that word resulting.
It's such a great word.
It's such a great word. Thousands and thousands of times I've said, no, we're resulting here. I'm resulting here. We're resulting here. You know, it's great. And I think it's a great place to start with in terms of how to decide what is resulting and what is decision quality. And maybe we can take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously this is a problem that has a really big focus in thinking in bets. So this is really taking it from a practical aspect, right? Like, so just for people who don't know, resulting is basically this heuristic that we use, this shortcut that we use to try to figure out what the quality of a decision is. And the shortcut that we're using is to look at the quality of the outcome and say, if I know that thing, then I would know the quality of the decision. Now, obviously, I want to be clear. This is talking about, when you don't have a big data set, right? If you have 10,000 coin flips and you look at the outcome of those 10,000 coin flips, you actually know something about the coin. And that's true if you could look at 10,000 decisions as well. Then the outcome would actually tell you something about the quality of the decision, assuming that the 10,000 was enough given the volatility, obviously. But I'm assuming all things being equal. But, one time, it's not going to tell you much. Now, I want to be clear also, depending on the volatility, right? If you live in a zero volatility world, then one outcome will tell you what you need to know. But we don't live in a zero volatility world, and one outcome is usually not that informative. So basically the idea is this, that decision quality is complex and it's really hard. You have to sort of reconstruct a couple things. One is sort of what was the knowledge that people had at the time, and that's actually quite a hard problem. I tackle that in chapter 2 with hindsight bias. The other thing you need to reconstruct is what were the possible outcomes and what were the probabilities of those outcomes occurring. And that's also quite hard. I mean, it's hard to do it in the first place, right? But when you're trying to do it retrospectively, it becomes really, really difficult. And so because that's actually quite complex, we sort of think about something simpler and more knowable, which is, like the ball got intercepted or it was caught for a touchdown. And if it's complete for a touchdown, we know it was a really good outcome. And so we say, okay, must have been a great decision. If it was intercepted, it must have been a bad decision. That's obviously kind of what happened to Pete Carroll in 2015. And you can see what the problems with that are, right? If we're going to become better decision makers, then we really have to understand in a deep way what the quality of the decisions are that we're making. And if we use the outcome as a proxy for that, we're going to learn a lot of really bad lessons. And I can show you that pretty easily by showing you a decision that has already been, where the quality has already been decided on. So I really like to go to this because then it seems obvious it's an error. If you go through a red light and you get in an accident, I'm assuming that you still think that going through red lights is just fine and that was not a bad decision. Likewise, if you go through a red light and you happen to somehow avoid the cars that are oncoming or whatever, I imagine you don't think, oh, that was a great choice. Let me keep doing that because I think I can be like, Mario Andretti or something and somehow manage to navigate that. So this is a case where we already know, it's not complicated to figure out what the decision quality is because there's very clear rules of the road. But for most of the types of decisions that we're making, it isn't settled. It isn't clear what the right answer is, whether it's, should Pete Carroll pass or not, whether Hillary Clinton should have campaigned in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, right? So whether it's should I have hired that person or not. I mean, it isn't clear. You have very, very little information at the time. Very often the information is quite imperfect. There can be faulty data in there where you just actually just don't know it. And even so, even if all of that weren't true, the coin can flip heads or it can flip tails, and it could turn out poorly 2% of the time. And guess what? You're going to observe that 2% of the time. And so you don't want to take that when it was 2% to occur and say that means that the decision was 100% bad. And then you could imagine that this gets particularly problematic as we start to take risk into the equation, right? There are certainly certain times when it's perfectly fine to risk a 2% bad outcome. But there are also times, as we know, when it's perfectly fine that you could get a bad outcome 80% of the time. And that's totally fine with you. you would be willing to take that on because the payoff for the 20% of the time outweighs the 80% of the time. And this is where resulting starts to really get in our way, because we sort of forget that that's what determines the quality of the decision, not just whether you won or lost.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about all of the complications that most of us have right now living with this virus, for example, right? And should I go to the supermarket or not? I'm currently, for example, living with my dad who's getting treatment for cancer. So there's...
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. But one of the challenges...
Did you have a vaccine yet?
Not yet, no, because, well, we don't know what that means for somebody undergoing treatment.
Oh, who's currently undergoing treatment, right?
Right.
You don't know the interaction.
Right. And so for me, certain decisions about, well, should I go outside? Should I go to the grocery store at this time? Or, these kinds of calculations, you're almost trying to make them on several times a day, right? Mm-hmm. And similarly, I think you have people who are like, oh, well, we met up for a, I don't know, underground rave party or something, and everybody's fine. And so it was a good decision. But I guess for any type of decision or big decisions, certainly we get, some of them you only get one or two shots at hiring the right person. Right. You only get one or two shots at marrying the right person. You only get one or two shots at, whatever the case may be. So you don't have that data set, and then we can trick ourselves into thinking we made a good or a bad decision.
Yeah. So I feel you there. So that's really, really tough. And so one of the things that we want to think about is we want to be really explicit about what is it that we believe to be true of the world. Because a lot of times we kind of leave that implicit, right, in the decision making. So if you're trying to make a decision about should I go to the grocery store, you have to say, what do you believe to be true of the world? So like, what is your risk of infection? If you get infection, what's the risk of passing that on to your dad? Then you have to say, what are the consequences of that? And we want to be actually quite explicit about these things, and we tend to sort of go with our gut. And that's...
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment.
That's where a lot of things go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of to that point, though, sometimes when we really feel the uncertainty, which we all do in COVID, we sort of go to this place of saying, well, then I can't decide anything because I don't know. So there's a couple of problems with that. The first is just a basic thing. Not deciding is deciding. So if you stick with the status quo, like if you don't fill a position because you're too uncertain about who you should hire, you're making an active decision to leave the position unfilled. And you're not weighing which is worse, not having somebody in the position versus having someone who might work out great or might not work out at all, and there's some uncertainty around that. And once you sort of realize that, it will sort of free you up to be willing to go and make the decision, because you sort of realize like status quo is still making a decision. That's sort of the first thing that will hang us up. The second thing is that what we need to do is change our frame and say certainty is unattainable. We can't get to it. So let's stop comparing our decision to certainty, and let's start thinking about everything that we do as an educated guess. And our job is to get as much educated into it as possible, to the point where I've reached a threshold where more information probably isn't going to change my mind. Right? So let me explain what I mean by like this idea of educated guess, and don't accept that I'd just be guessing, so therefore I should just go with my gut. So like I can talk about something that you certainly haven't seen. So we're on a computer. You do not know the desk that my computer is sitting on. But if I say to you, hey, listen, do me a favor, Ben, what do you think that if you had to give a guess of what the weight of my desk is, and then kind of give like a lower bound to that, like what's the least amount it could weigh and what's the most amount it could weigh?
Yeah, so it's got to support your laptop. It's got to, it's got to be a desk that that you can readily buy, which has got to support lots of things on top of them. So I'm guessing on the low end, 20 pounds. Like that's for kind of a flimsy-ish type of desk. And if you've got, I don't know, how much is a big, like mahogany, solid wood, through 200 pounds maybe between something like that.
Perfect. I'm sorry, my puppy has come.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Yes, he's 9 weeks old. We love him.
Oh, lovely.
Okay, so that's great. So you said 20 pounds on the low end, and you gave a good rationale for why. It could be flimsy, it could be whatever. If it's a big mahogany desk, maybe it weighs 200 pounds. And notice here that you could have given me the answer, well, how could I possibly know? I haven't seen your desk.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, what you did is you actually started to think about, well, what do I know about things that are desk-like? And it turns out that you actually know quite a bit. Because if you think about what's the range of things that 0 pounds to, I don't know, what is the earth weigh, right? Like a lot.
Yeah.
So you actually eliminated most of the range of things, that things could weigh. So for example, if you had to make a decision, you haven't ever seen my desk, and I said to you, hey, could you send some people over to move my desk? You're not going to send over 20 people to do that. Can you just hold on one second? I just want to make sure that thank you, that the door is closed. Okay, good. I apologize. Okay.
No problem. I've got a dog at home myself, so I get it.
Yeah. All right. So let me go back to that. So if I were to say to you something like, hey, could you send some people over to help me move this desk? And I haven't told you anything more about it. You're not going to send 20 people over to move the desk, right? So you're going to make some pretty good guesses. Might you send too many people? Sure. Maybe one too few, maybe. But you're going to be you're going to be in a good zone for that. And this is what we want to always be thinking about is, what do I know about the thing that I'm trying to guess about? And that's going to get the most educated into the guess. Then the next step is to say, what could I find out that would help me to figure out this? So you could ask me, how long is the desk? What is it made of? And that's also going to help you narrow more. And so the fact that you're not just saying, I'd just be guessing, let me not even try, actually gets you to start thinking about what are the things that I could then find out that would then help me with this. And then on top of that, when you then say to somebody, I think that desk weighs between 20 and 200 pounds, they may now offer you things that they know. So inherent in that is you're asking for other people to help you. And this is the thing that we need to realize is that any decision that we make, again, don't compare it to perfect. Say, what is the information that I know that I can help make this a better estimate? What are the things that I can find out? Who would be the right person to ask? How can I get that knowledge from them? What is true of the world in general? And then stop at the point where you say, more information is probably not going to help me. And this does two things for you. It increases the accuracy of the decisions that you make because you're actually thinking about this knowledge piece. But the other thing it does is it makes you aware that you're not doing it with perfect accuracy, that you have to be uncertain because that's the way the world is. And that makes us sort of metabolize and feel better about kind of what's on the back end. The other thing that it does is it allows you to adjust as you go along. So one of the things that happens is that once we've made a decision, we'll very often get entrenched in it. Mm-hmm. It becomes almost like something that we own, like part of our identity. And then we refuse to change our mind, partly, I think, because we sort of think that once we make the decision, we're declaring some sort of certainty around this. So you saw this actually with masks, right? So one of the things I saw on the mask wearing thing was, but Fauci said in the early beginning of February that you should wear a mask. Well, yeah, but then we learned new stuff, right? I mean, in March, I was scrubbing my groceries to within an inch of their life. I don't do that anymore because I learned new stuff. So I don't feel like I need to keep doing that. And this does allow you to be more flexible and more reactive as new information comes in because you're recognizing on the front end that you don't have 100% of the information. So you start being much more on the lookout and more flexible in incorporating the new information into your models.
This kind of myth of certainty, it's another term I've been using a fair bit, is that we're hardwired to want and crave that certainty. So what you're describing is for many it's not intuitive, even though it's incredibly necessary to test for a quality decision. And maybe we could dive in a little bit to when to go fast and when to slow down here, because that's
it's actually related.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I like the way that you link that together, by the way. That's a really
Cool.
interesting linkage that I really appreciate. Yeah, so let's think about what happens when you go fast on a decision. You're essentially increasing your error rate, right? I mean, obviously, think about it, right? Like, uh, it's sort of the same as if you see like 325 times 537. If you go really fast and you sort of do a guesstimate, right? Well, I know 300 times 500 is 1500, so it's probably like 16 to 1700. Like, I'll just do that, right? That's not exactly right because I went super, super fast. If I
Hmm.
slow down and I actually take my pencil out and I do it, then I can give you an accurate answer. So that's what I mean. Like, when you go fast, you're just going to increase your error rate. So what that means is that when we increase our error rate, we are at risk of increasing the probability we get an outcome that we don't like. Okay. So because actually that you're jacking up the uncertainty, the
Mm.
faster you go, the less certainty you have around the decision. So that's that connection that you just made, which I love, right? Okay. So if we know that we have this trade-off between time and accuracy, or we can call it time and certainty, then that now tells us when we should go fast and when we should go slow. We can now actually work backwards from that and say, well, we can go fast when we can tolerate a higher chance of a bad outcome, right?
Hmm.
So, as an example, in your case with your dad, you should be pretty intolerant of a bad outcome,
Hmm.
right? As you're trying to think about your choice, should I go to a grocery store or not? So that's a case where you would really want to slow down because you're going to be quite intolerant of a bad outcome. Well, you might get a bad outcome, but you're going to be intolerant of any increase in the chances of a bad outcome because you didn't take some time with the decision. Okay, so that's a good case of that. But what to order for dinner?
Yeah.
That's a case where you should be pretty tolerant of a bad outcome. Why?
Sometimes it might. Sometimes if you're back when we were traveling, that might be a different. There might be a different calculation going on there if you're in a new country and you don't know what's in the food and
Well, that's
what the
true.
local
Yeah.
healthcare
Thinking
is
about
like.
like,
But
say,
absolutely,
was it bottled water or did it come from a
yeah,
tap?
yeah, exactly,
Actually
yeah, yeah, yeah,
caused me to have a huge problem with my, right, but
yeah,
a
yeah. No,
normal
no,
human.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. So, okay, so this is actually where we can reveal that we're actually kind of bad at this particular problem. Like, when can we go fast and when
Mm.
we can go slow? Because if we go back to like before COVID, I think we've all either maybe you're this type of person, or you certainly know this type of person who's in the restaurant and they're just like they cannot decide what to order off that menu. Not only that, they're like quizzing everybody. They want to know what everybody else is ordering. They're asking the wait staff for recommendations. And even when it comes time to actually order, they're like, let me go last. I want to go last. So they're taking a lot of time with this decision about what to order off the menu. And this actually gets into this issue, which is a really big problem. Like, if you had to sort of get to the heart of a lot of where our decisions go wrong, is we're kind of thinking about what is happening in the moment as we're kind of facing the problem, as opposed to if I were to look back at this in a long time, what would I think I would do, should do, or if I were to look ahead, like a long time in the future, what do I think I should do? This is actually how you end up going to a rave in COVID, because in the moment it seems like a really good idea, but obviously in a year you look back on that and you're like, what was I thinking? Like, why did I go to a rave? So we want to actually sort of get out of the facing the decision down, like staring into the maw, and get ourselves away from the decision. So in the moment when we're trying to decide what to order off the menu, it feels like a very big decision. We're sort of imagining, okay, I was trying to decide between the chicken and the fish, and now I got the chicken. It sucks. How much you say to yourself, like, oh, I feel like that was a mistake and I should have ordered the other thing. And these things are like resulting in hindsight bias, and you really regret it and you're sad. So this is sort of what we're trying to defend against, right? Like, I ordered the wrong thing and now I'm sad. I made such a big mistake. And why did I order that? And I should have ordered the fish. And why didn't I know? And this is what is causing you to go through these cycles trying to get to some sort of certainty, which is unattainable because you don't have a time machine about whether you're going to actually like that food. So what we want to do is actually pull ourselves back from that and get to that kind of longer time horizon that helps us see our decisions more clearly and say, let's say you got a really dry piece of chicken in a restaurant. If I see you in a year and I say to you, hey, how's your year been? Do you think that your answer to that is going to be affected by the dry chicken a year ago?
Yeah, probably not.
No. What if I see you in a month?
Probably not.
Right. What if I see you actually even a week later? You've had 21 meals since then.
For me, probably not. I know some people that would still hold a grudge, but probably not.
Right.
But probably not.
So this is something that I call the happiness test, which is actually quite helpful for figuring out one of the pieces of the puzzle for when you can go fast and when you can go slow, which is if it's the sort of shorter the period of time in which even getting kind of a bad outcome is not going to really affect your happiness, where happiness would be a proxy. So it could be like your bottom line, it could be your health, it could be whatever. That when you sort of think about it that way, what you realize is that this is an inconsequential decision. It's actually not going to affect my happiness that much. And yes, I might feel some regret right afterwards, but so what? Because when I think about my overall happiness, this really doesn't have any effect on it at all, which means that we should be quite tolerant of increasing error, right? Of increasing the probability that we get a bad outcome. So that's kind of getting down into this impact question. What is the actual impact of getting a bad outcome? And the lower the impact of getting a bad outcome, the more that we should be willing to go fast and decide with much less certainty, because we just really aren't going to care very much. Then we can get into the question of kind of optionality. And optionality comes in two forms. One is if it's a repeating decision, we can go fast, right? So meals are like this as well. So if I know that I'm going to get a chance to hire to eat another meal in like 4 hours, I should be willing to go fast. In hiring, we could sort of see that play out, like hiring a senior person versus an intern. So now we can see options and impact for both of those. A senior person, if you get it wrong, it's going to have a very big impact on your business. If you hire a bad intern, who cares? And you're going to hire a lot of interns as a ratio to the number of senior people that you hire. So the intern decision is going to be a repeating decision, right? So that tells us that, in terms of the intern hiring process, we can go pretty fast. In terms of the senior person, we want to slow down and take more time with that decision. Then there's another way that optionality plays in, not just in terms of repeating, but also in terms of reversibility. How likely is it that if we get a bad outcome, we could shift? We could go back to some other option, maybe that we rejected in the past, or we could move on to a new option. That's going to be true of the interns. Their interns are aplenty. There's lots and lots of options to hire new interns. And internships are easy to unwind, right? Like if you hire someone for a 3-month internship, you can let them go after a week. And it's kind of no harm, no foul, very, very reversible. So we can see that everything there would be conspiring to get us to go quickly. So we want to think about that frame of options and impact. Now, just as an aside, there is a situation where it is high impact and hard to reverse, where you would still be able to speed your decisions up. I just want to make that clear. And that's when you have 2 or more options that have already crossed a threshold that those options would satisfy your needs. Now, so just to sort of ground this so that people understand, this is a place where people go really, really slow when they could go really, really fast. So in the before times, if you have a big vacation and you've got it narrowed down to Paris and Rome, obviously this is very high impact. If I catch you in a year and you had a crappy vacation, it's clearly going to still have affected your happiness. It's going to cost a lot of money. Once you're in Paris, it's like, what are you going to do? Fly home? It's not really reversible. And for most people, those types of vacations are not going to be a repeating option, right? You're not going to be able to go on another vacation in a month and then it doesn't matter so much that one vacation was so bad. So this isn't going to satisfy any of those things would normally tell you to go a little bit faster. But once you've got it narrowed down to those 2 options, what happens to people? They really get caught. Like, I've got to decide. And I think it's partly because they sort of realize, like, oh no, this is actually quite high impact and it's very hard to reverse. So I think they feel like they need to be certain which one is better. But the whole reason why you're going slow there, why that decision is so hard, is because the options are basically identical, at least as far as you can tell under uncertainty, right? Because you're not omniscient, you don't have a time machine. So it's the closeness of the options that is making it so hard to choose between them. And we have the illusion, the certainty. What'd you call that? The certainty illusion?
The
or
myth of certainty.
The myth of certainty. Mm-hmm. I love that. We have the myth of certainty that if we just tried hard enough, we'd be able to tell the difference between Paris and Rome. Mm-hmm. And the answer is no, you can't. Mm. So what's happening is that because they're basically the same, as far as, we talk about visual acuity, as far as your cognitive acuity is concerned, they're the same. That's what actually hangs us up, at which point we should probably just be flipping a coin. Mm-hmm. So the way that you actually figure out that that's the problem is to do something called the only option test, which is just basically to imagine that this were your only option. So if Paris were my only option, would I be thrilled? If Rome were my only option, would I be thrilled? And you can see how you could do this with job candidates, right? Like you'll be hiring for a particular position. This happens with interns. Mm-hmm. You only have one internship, but there's two people who seem really great. And all of a sudden you find yourself, for a decision you should go pretty fast on, like cycling, trying to figure out which of those two, and everybody's debating it, and it's hot and heavy, and you somehow think you could figure out which one's going to be better. And the answer is no, because the point is that they're identical as far as you can tell. So flip a coin between the two of them. So basically what the only option test is doing is it's saying, with any decision that we make, we want to sort of get options past the threshold. And once they've met that threshold, we should be relatively fast in sort of picking among the things that have met whatever our threshold is. So I think the example I give in a book is like nobody has trouble with like going to Paris or spending time in a fish cannery, right? Because a fish cannery doesn't actually get past the threshold. It's the fact that it's gotten past the threshold. And that's true in hiring, right? It's like you have some hiring process that's sorting people to the point where they've become good options and they've met the threshold, and then don't spend a lot of cycles trying to decide among the people who have met the threshold. Mm-hmm. That's true for investment decisions. It's true for vacations. It's true for choosing off of a menu.
Sometimes, here's another term I've used a lot in the last little while, hyper-optimization. That people love to hyper-optimize to get that little incremental, little extra something or other, and the cost associated with trying to get that little extra bit in a decision is just not worth it.
Yeah, so actually there's quite a few problems with hyper-optimization. I like the way you put that. In science, we call that maximizing.
Right.
But hyper-optimization is like, I think, more intuitive. So I like that term better. I may steal it from you.
Sure. Sure.
I'm going to have to do that in the myth of uncertainty. I have so many things now. I love it. So with hyper-optimization, there's a few problems that occur from that. One is that you've given yourself the illusion that you actually are certain, which you're not. And that creates all sorts of problems that I've already mentioned with endowment and not being willing to move off of options and change your mind, and all sorts of stuff that comes from the fact that you thought you were certain in the first place, that you're much more likely to fall into this like, this issue of like motivated reasoning, where you sort of start to support your past choices and your past beliefs in the way that you're processing new information. And you'll be less flexible. You're going to be less likely to quit things that you should, to change your mind, to pivot, whatever word you want. I just use quit. I think that should be a positive word, but whatever.
I want to talk about that as well in a moment.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that. So that's kind of number one, is that these issues of sort of, because you believe you're certain and you've put so much work into getting to that place, when you're not actually certain, you're probably going to become more in doubt. It's going to cause downstream problems. That's kind of number one. But number two is that you're spending your time on the wrong thing, right? Like, okay, so let's say that you knew that between two options that you're considering, that there was a 0.1% difference between the two of them. And with enough work, like let's imagine you could even accomplish it, right? With enough time and enough work, you could actually distinguish which thing was 0.1% better. So let's imagine you could do that. You're missing out. All that time is time that you could go find getting other things across the threshold, finding other opportunities, right? Like as we think about like diversifying the decisions and the portfolios that we have not just investment portfolios, but like it's portfolios of all the decisions that we make, right? We always want to be finding the stuff that we're winning to, right? That's going to actually increase the quality of our life, increase our bottom line, help us to advance toward our goals. And you might spend all that time that you're spending trying to find something that's 0.1% better. You could actually be going off and finding something that's going to like advance you 3%. But you're not doing that because you're not looking at the other options, because you're trying to distinguish between, differences that don't really matter. Now, that's not to say that a 0.1% difference doesn't sometimes matter, right? Like, and you may be in a business where your job is actually to see those 0.1% differences.
Or if you're an Olympic athlete or something like that, where
right.
The competition is so fierce that you absolutely need to find that 0.1%.
Right. But that is a thresholding issue, right? So when I go back to that idea of sorting versus picking, our job is to get things over the threshold. Now, if 0.1% really does actually matter to you, that can happen in like electronic trading of options, for example. Sometimes like those little edges really, really matter. And you actually could model that out in some way that would get you to some kind of decision acuity that maybe would get you there. But that's a thresholding issue, right? So that's sort of a meta problem that tells you. But there are people who are trying to hyper optimize everything, right? Including like what to order off a menu. I mean, that's essentially what people are doing when they're taking 15 minutes with that decision, where it's like, look, you don't like eggplant. You love mashed potatoes. Okay, right? Like, go for that. It's fine. Just sort it off into things you like and things you don't like. And why don't you spend time with the people at the table instead of annoying everybody around you? Because this is not a case where it makes sense to do that. And the opposite of hyper-optimization is what's called satisficing, or essentially saying it's good enough, right? And that's that thresholding issue. And again, I just want to say what's good enough is going to be different for different positions. That threshold for an intern is going to be lower. What's good enough to hire an intern is going to be much lower than what's good enough to hire a senior person. But no matter what, they each have thresholds. And once we're past the threshold, flip a coin.
Yeah, and you've got some wonderful statistics in the book about how much time people spend figuring out what to wear, what to eat, these kinds of things. And probably the way in which most people make decisions, the amount of time spending on what to watch on Netflix or whatever, is inversely proportional to the amount of time that they should be spending on how much money to put away for retirement, these kinds of things, these bigger questions that probably require much more time.
Yeah, so I have a theory about this.
Sure.
Or a hypothesis, I guess,
sure.
more accurately. I think that because we think we know ourselves, and because they're kind of simpler decisions, the things like what to order, what to watch on Netflix, or what to wear, or what to order, I think we feel like it's solvable. Right? I think that feels a little bit more in like the 2 + 2 = 4 category.
It's the satisfaction that people get.
Yeah. So we feel like we should know what we're going to like on the television. Right? We should know what we're going to like off a menu, and that if we just think about it and we sort of query and get enough information, because we know our own preferences, which secretly we don't, like we have to try sample stuff to learn about ourselves. But we think we have the illusion that we know about ourselves. I guess that goes into the myth of certainty. We think we actually know ourselves. That we should be able to get to the right answer. So we spend time trying to get to the right answer, which you can't, because it's an illusion. And even if you could, who cares? But with something like what to save for retirement, it's so complex and so complicated that I think we feel like we couldn't possibly get to the right answer. And so in some sense, we don't even try, right? And I think that's why we have it reversed, is because one of the problems, when it feels really solvable, like a simple addition equation, then we want to solve it. And when it feels like, like calculus or something, right? Like we're solving vectors, people are just like, rah!
Yeah.
Right? And they just sort of like gut it out. Like they just kind of go with their gut, because I think they sort of see how daunting that problem is, and it's not really solvable. So then they forget that every guess is an educated guess, and that you should actually be trying. And that causes the time that you spend on those two types of decisions to get inverted, I think.
One of the
I don't know what you think about that hypothesis.
No, I think that is incredibly. I think it's valid. I think it's certainly worth testing, but I think it makes a lot of sense intuitively. But you need to test it. But the other aspect to this as well is I was thinking about some of those decisions that aren't two-way doors that you can quit easily.
Yeah, so that's the reversibility.
Reversibility, piece, right?
Like how easy is it? Like that's the interns, right? It's pretty easy to fire the intern after a week, and you got 20 of them lined up behind.
And even then, and here's where I want to talk a little bit about quitting, that it makes sense sometimes to quit even when the costs are incredibly high. And I was, when I was reading that, I was thinking about a conversation I had on this podcast with Kathy O'Dowd, who is a mountaineer, mountain climber. So mountain climbers get this. She gets this in terms of, I've spent all this money on this expedition. We've prepared it. We're climbing Everest, and we're halfway up the mountain, and we have to turn back. We can see it. It's right. It's at the top. I can see the summit, and I have to go back because if we climb it, then we're going to run out of oxygen and we're all going to die on the top of this thing. So as much as it's painful to watch this thing and to see, here's the summit, we've passed we have to turn around by 2:00. It's 2:15. We've got to turn around now. And she gets that. But sometimes for some of these big decisions, and it could be a relationship, it could be a job, it could be a whatever, there's a cost associated with quitting, but it's still a good idea to quit, or at least to consider it very realistically.
Okay, so first of all, that's my book.
Oh, right, okay.
I'm very excited. So I'm very happy that you asked me about that. So I'll give a few previews. So first of all, obviously, the work that Angela Duckworth has done on grit is incredibly important. And this understanding, like sometimes we give up too soon. And that we ought to, just because something is hard, not necessarily give it up, not if the goal is worth achieving. So this idea of sometimes we sort of get the perseverance problem wrong in the sense of under persevering, right? Like quitting too soon is, I think, an important thing to consider. But it's definitely the popular sort of argument, right? Like if we think about a debate between under persistence and over persistence, right? Like sticking to things too little or sticking to things too long past the point at which you can turn around, right? Which is the Kathy O'Dowd problem. Grit has certainly won the day. And I think that it just sort of makes for a nice story that relates, I think, a little bit to like the hero's journey. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's the idea that you're supposed to come to the edge.
Yes.
Right. And then sort of face that down and either come out the other side, or even if you die trying, you're still a hero. So we like that idea of like persevering in the face of adversity and sort of facing down your fears and coming to the edge, which would be like if Kathy did not do that and she almost died and turned around. Which obviously she would like to avoid. So that's the popular literature. But what's really interesting is when you dig into the scientific literature, this problem of over persistence is actually the much bigger issue. We tend to over persist. We over persist in our beliefs. I think everybody should make sure to read Adam Grant's new book, which is Think Again, which talks about that idea of how much we cling to our beliefs and won't give them up. We over persist in terms of courses of action, whether it's a project we're doing at work or an investment thesis that we have. Or so like how many times has somebody just like been dating somebody and then all their friends could say they can see they should break up with them, and then they finally break up with them, and then what do they always say? I should have broken up with them like 6 months earlier. Right? Okay, so that's this over persistence problem. And what basically happens is that we have this intuition that when the world tells us we should quit, the weather's bad and it's too late for us to be on the mountain and we don't have enough oxygen or whatever, that obviously we're going to turn around. But Kathy O'Dowd is actually quite unusual in that. And if you look at the top of Everest, it's littered with the bodies of people who did not behave like her, right? Who, despite lots of signals that they were past the turnaround time, that they didn't have enough oxygen, the weather was bad or whatever. There's movies about this. that they did not turn around. And we do that in our own lives as well. And all you have to do is think about something like Blockbuster, right? To understand that, like, you're persisting in having people come to a location to rent things, right? And meanwhile, Netflix is like eating your lunch. So I want to go back and actually sort of grab onto one thing that you said that I think is so important. As you said, even when the cost is really high. And this is something that I really want to point out, is it's thinking about cost the wrong way. We should care very little about the cost that we've already incurred. It matters not at all. We should care about the costs of moving forward. This is an expected value problem, right? Combined with risk, actually, right? So do I have positive expectancy? And what is the risk I am willing to bear in order to continue? But because we're thinking about the costs that we already have, we're including, can I end up recovering those costs? Can I end up turning this around and having it be a winner? So you can think about it this way, like, I'm halfway up the mountain. I've obviously spent time and resources and money. Can I make this trip work and make it so that that was worthwhile? That's that type of thinking that causes people to not quit. If instead you say, you imagine someone helicoptered me to this point on the mountain, I suddenly appeared here by magic, right? Is it correct for me to continue up the mountain now? Because I literally landed here by magic, like someone snapped their fingers and here I am. That's how we want to think about it. Is it, if this were a brand new decision, would I be willing to continue? And that's not how we think. And that's a lot of what causes the over persistence. So you could think about it as like, I have a loss that's a paper loss, my time, my money, sometimes it's my identity, whatever. And if I quit, that's going to turn it into a realized loss. But if I don't quit, maybe I can get it back. Right? And it really messes us up. It really, really just screws us up. That's the whole kind of ball of wax right there.
And how many times have we all heard that, oh, winners never quit and quitters never win thing?
Right. Winners quit a lot, actually.
Yeah.
Win a lot.
Yeah. I was thinking also about Alex Honnold. I don't know if you saw that free solo.
So he's actually part of the book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Oh.
So, yeah, because he quit.
Yes, he did.
I don't remember that in the movie, but just he turned around. So maybe because he has no amygdala, like there was something weird. Who knows? I mean, he has an amygdala, but it seems to be quite a quiet amygdala. So it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's very rare what he did, particularly given that there were sort of, as we've talked. So just so people know, he free climbed El Capitan. And there's a documentary out about it called Free Solo, which is wonderful. People should totally watch it. And everybody remembers that he made it to the top, and nobody remembers that on his first try, he turned around. And this was pretty amazing, right? Because there's obviously a lot of costs associated with that, because there's people filming him. So it's quite remarkable. So I love that you brought him up, because he's someone I'm quite fascinated with, actually.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and it's so true that we should quit more often than we do. So,
I mean, I think that people certainly know about the sunk cost fallacy. You can think about that as an accounting error, right? Sort of I'm taking costs that I had and sort of bringing them into the calculation as if I weren't sort of helicoptered into this position or magically appeared here. So I'm not treating it as a new decision, and whether the expectancy going forward is positive. But this is, this problem is much more than a sunk cost problem. This really has very deeply to do with who are we, who our identity. As we start to make decisions and we enter courses of action, we become very endowed to those courses of action. It becomes part of who we are. And you can think about that even in terms of like, who are you? I'm a doctor. Right? It's not like I'm somebody who does medicine, right? It's like I'm a doctor. I mean, these things really get put into our identity. And when we think about that sort of combined with this hero's journey problem, right? Like the heroes are the ones who face it down, who come to the edge, who almost face certain death. And then we know, right? See, that's the thing. It's like when you're sort of facing death, you know, nobody can question that you should have stopped, right? But when you do it halfway up the mountain, people are like, really? Well, then how come you started in the first place?
I think
So,
sometimes people
sorry, go ahead.
misinterpret that hero's journey thing as well, because that's also a device that is really useful when you tell your story to someone in a compelling way
Yes,
externally. But if that's a story that you tell yourself, that's a
which we
problem,
do.
right?
Yeah, so external and internal validity are very intertwined.
Mm, mm,
So yeah, so I think that is really important is that when you tell that story, you want them to understand the reason why you turned around. So you're going to tell that as if you're at the edge. But then we also do that to ourselves because we don't want to live in the uncertainty of not knowing.
yeah.
But what if I had continued? Maybe if I had just put a little bit more money into it. Like you could see this as like a startup problem, right? Like if I had just raised another round or I had mortgaged my house or I had whatever, like maybe that would have worked out, right? And of course, we all live in survivorship bias, right? We live in you with all these stories of the people who did mortgage their house
Mm-hmm.
and they happened to survive. And we don't see the 20, 30, 40, 50 companies that are behind them who did the same thing and failed. And obviously, that's what we should care about,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm just like so fascinated with this topic. I'm living and breathing it every single day. And like I'm so deep down into it. So
I
it's
can't
so
wait till
funny
this
you
book
brought it
comes
up.
out. No, I can't wait till this book comes out
This
because,
is like such a passion for me.
well, one of the things I have I rebel a little bit against, have a visceral kind of reaction to, is a sort of toxic positivity around quitting, about trusting your gut, about a lot of the things that you've written about and that make a lot of sense. And it's also backed by all the science. So I'm looking forward to
Well,
this
yeah, this
book
is
coming out.
the science on this particular issue is deep and
Mm-hmm.
broad,
Mm-hmm.
ranging from work that Kahneman and Tversky have done to Richard Thaler to um, this wonderful, wonderful scientist named Barry Staw, who people don't know very well, but he's done such incredible work on this topic. Um, this is something that people, Nobel laureates are very
Mm-hmm.
sort of embedded and deep. And Katie Milkman, who has an amazing book called How to Change, that's coming out in the spring. She's incredible and does a lot of stuff about how to sort of make positive change in your life. But she's done work on this as well. In the investor world, there's someone named Alex Imus, who has in the past done work with
Mm-hmm.
Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers. And he has some really great work on these kinds of decisions and quitting decisions and investing. And this is something that people are really paying a lot of attention to. And so it's my favorite kind of topic to be in because there is so much science on it. It's not really conjecture, right? And that's obviously you can tell from thinking about and how to decide. That's the space that I love to live in.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm conscious of time, so I know that we need to wrap it up. Just before we do, I did want to touch on this thing about decision quality, how to decide, and why we don't learn about this. Why isn't how to decide a course in high school?
Yeah. So, okay, so obviously I co-founded the Alliance for Decision Education for exactly this
Mm-hmm.
reason. I'm quite confused as to why we teach trigonometry, but not
Right.
decision education, right? Like trigonometry, if you're going to become a structural engineer, you can take that in college.
Mm-hmm.
I, and actually historically, this is interesting. The reason why trigonometry was in the curriculum was because it was so hard and disconnected from anything in real life that it was a sorting mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so remember I was talking about sorting. It was a way to get people across a threshold that like, because we used to put people on tracks and that kind of thing. And so this was a way to sort the ones who were just willing to do something that for no reason other than like, I want to conquer something hard. So, but here it sits, it's still there. When teaching people how to make good decisions, really skilling them up seems like a much more important 21st century problem, particularly in the information ecosystem that we live in now, where like sorting out what's true and what's not and what to do about it and so on and so forth, it seems like it's a really big problem. So, I have some thoughts about why I think we don't teach it. Some of it just has to do with the educational system is slow and it's hard to change. For sure. And we've certainly found that with the Alliance, and we're addressing it in a particular way, which I'm happy to talk about in a second. But think it's because people don't know they have a problem. I mean, if you think about it, like think about the history of science. It wasn't until the 70s when like Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler come along where they're like, by the way, you have a problem with your decision making. And they had to convince everybody in the same way that like I feel like Jack Horner had to convince everybody that dinosaurs were actually warm-blooded, right? It took a really long time because everyone was like, no, they're reptiles. Look at them. And they was like, no, that's not true. They're warm-blooded. They're like birds. Because, you know, and I think it's because most people have the intuition that they're pretty good at decision making because we do it all the time. I make decisions every day, don't you? Just like I walk. You're going to come teach me a class on walking? So I think that that's actually part of the problem is that we don't necessarily realize that we're not so good at this particular thing. You know, because we sort of bumble along and we make it through our lives and whatever. So what we're doing actually at the Alliance, sort of realizing that, is we're doing what's called field building. So we're taking, you know, academics, people whose research is sort of in our center of gravity and trying to pull them in to our center of gravity. That could mean seeing people who've done work that is in adults and getting them to sort of repeat that and do that for kids in K through 12, or you know, people whose research is sort of like adjacent to ours. And bringing that in, same thing in the educational space, looking at nonprofits that are definitely in our orbit. So that would include like civics education or financial literacy, people who are also working on this problem, like the Decision Education Foundation would be one of those, and bring them into the orbit. In terms of sort of creating we have a fellowship for teachers to create curricula in order, you know, to sort of get the science and the curricula and sort of what would we be teaching people. And then this push-pull problem, working with parents to start raising awareness that this is something that you would want your children to get, working with businesses to say this is something that we really want people to be skilled up in, pushing on the policy side with educators to try to get that ship to move. And we're really modeling it off of social emotional learning. So that was something that about a decade ago people started to see come into the school day and get taught every year from K to 12 as something that was really important to be teaching kids and to make space for in the school day. And I think that when you look at that, it's like many things. It feels like it sort of popped up one day, but there were actually organizations, one of them is called Castle, that have been working for almost 30 years to make that happen. Sort of on the same model, like building the field, defining the field, getting people to care, creating push-pull, creating the curricula, the scientific evidence for why it's important, and then you start to see it all of a sudden appear in the school day. So we have a very long time horizon that we're thinking about in order to try to rectify the fact that we're not teaching this. And cross our fingers, hopefully people will go check us out and support us if you can in some way. But we're very passionate about the project.
Fantastic. That sounds great. And do you, just before we wrap up, I'd love to get your views on, if you had a guess, okay, so if you had a guess, I'll do the table question back to you, but if you had a guess, like a kind of percentage of, say, CEOs of S&P 500 companies who make good quality decisions or have some form of basis for making good quality decisions, what at the moment, what would your guess be?
Yeah, so I think in this day and age, you know, that percentage would be pretty high.
Okay.
It's just a question of how good is the process. So I think I'm answering a slightly different question. How many people think they have a process and have thought about it? I think that's kind of high, right? Like that they've actually thought about what's the process I want to do, what's the answer. And I think that the majority of them are trying to get to that answer. The problem is that the majority of them haven't gotten to the right answer. Actually, let me rephrase that. I don't want to say the right answer because I don't think anybody has the right answer, but haven't gotten to an answer that's better. That, you know, like I think that Noise is coming out, which is Kahneman, Siboney, and Sunstein. And that book is so amazing at really laying out not just the problem of bias, but also noise, which is this randomness in decision making, and really talking about what the need for really good process around this is in order to discipline this. And when you go into organizations, what you find is that, you know, they try their intent is to have a good process, but when you actually look at the process, it's actually tends to be amplifying bias and noise. not reducing it. I think because our intuitions about this stuff aren't great. So, I think noise is it's going to be a huge hit. I think it's possibly a more important book than Thinking in Bets, and I hope people will read it. But that's really going to make the case for create a better process. So it's like a twofold answer. I think they're trying, and it's a high percentage of them who are trying and are, consistent process and so on and so forth. I think how many of them have actually gotten to the stuff that would actually address these sources of error, I think that's pretty low.
Right. Okay, great. So just want to wrap up. I want to thank you for your time here. This was fabulous. Great. Did you did you want to mention anything that we didn't get a chance to? And I guess secondly, where can people find you, your work, get the book, all that good stuff?
Well, this is pretty thorough conversation, including talking about the things I'm thinking about for the future. So there you go. So just people can go to annieduke.com. That's my website. You can contact me there. Video, newsletters, like all that stuff. Buy my books, or, whatever. That's all there. And then I'm pretty active on Twitter. It depends. I'm less active when I'm actually actively writing a book, so I'm a little less active right now because my time is limited because the free time I have is actually spent writing. So, but you can find me there at Annie Duke. So those are really the best places to find me. And then also just to reiterate, I'd love it if people could go check out the Alliance for Decision Education. That would be amazing.
I'll put all that in the show notes. So
thank you.
Fabulous. Annie, thank you very much once again. This was great.
Thank you.